Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast brought to you by MedSchoolCoach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Hey guys, it's Dr. Mehta here from MedSchoolCoach and Prospective Doctor. Now, you may have heard USMLE Step 1 just changed from a 3-digit score to a pass-fail, and this is huge news. Now, it's not going to change until January 2022, but it's just such big news that we had to do a podcast on it. And in fact, we have this awesome 2-part podcast. The first part is myself and Dr. David Flick, who is a Army physician as well as MedSchoolCoach's Director of Residency Advising. He's going to talk with me about how this affects U.S.-based med students. And then in the second part, I have Elias Farah, who is a fourth-year St. George medical student who is currently in the match process, also one of MedSchoolCoach's master tutors, and we're going to talk about how this affects the international student. So this is going to be a great 2-part podcast. Be sure to subscribe. I know you guys are going to love this. If you're international, skip to part 2. If you're a U.S. student, listen to part 1. Thanks, guys.
Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast. This one is specifically on international medical graduates and the effect of USMLE changing to pass-fail. Dr. Mehta here again, and today I'm joined by Elias Farah, a St. George University student who is actually currently in the match process and has been kind enough to join us to talk about it. He's also one of the MedSchoolCoach's master tutors. The guy is phenomenal. Elias, welcome.
Hey, Sahil, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So, my first question is, when did you hear about this and what was your initial reaction to the USMLE Step 1 going to pass-fail?
So I heard about this yesterday when they announced it. I was actually in my rotations and I saw all the fellows and residents kind of buzzing, all the medical students, and everyone was talking about it. And I'm like, what's going on? And I looked and I saw the big announcement. My first reaction was a little bit of shock. I didn't think they were going to do this. I knew that I knew that they were kind of talking about it, but to see it actually come to fruition was pretty shocking to me. Everyone was very surprised and, none of us saw it coming.
Yeah. And I mean, that was my first reaction as well, which was, wow, I'm shocked because I had heard about this through the grapevines, but I didn't actually think it was going to happen. And so when it actually happened, I was like, wow, I can't believe they did that, particularly because USMLE Step 1 is just such an important test. And I mean, for the St. George's student out there or for the international medical graduate, I mean, you can kind of relate to just how important that test is and how much emphasis was placed on it throughout your sort of training.
Exactly. The big concern that we have is, as an IMG, one of our only ways to separate ourselves against the rest of the pack and rest of the applicants is through our standardized testing. And if we don't have that, we get a little concerned on, how these residency programs are going to rank us to everybody else. And yeah, it's a little concerning. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but it'd be interesting to see once this starts how residency programs are going to respond to this.
Yeah. So give me an idea, right? So you're a first-year SGU student. Back when you were a first year, like how important was that step to your preparation, to your thought process, to everything that was when you were going to class?
So from the moment we stepped on the island, it was all about the Step 1. In fact, we had an emergency medicine doctor who's kind of like the residency guru of our school come in and basically scare the crap out of us, saying Step 1 is the most important test of your life, and it will dictate what residency you match in and what kind of job you're going to get, and pretty much your entire medical career. And from there, we were scared to the bone that, oh my God, we had to study for this test. And now that it's being pass-fail, everything is being turned upside down.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's so shocking, right? It's like you go from this test, and I told my students the same thing, whether they were US or IMG students, that Step 1 is the most important test of your life, right? It's the test that you can take once. Yeah, you can take it again if you fail, but if you fail, you got other issues going on. But, you only take it once. Your score matters so much when it comes to the type of residency you can do, the place that you're going to match at, and that just determines your entire life, right? I mean, you're going into interventional radiology, that's a very different field and takes a very different mentality and has a very different lifestyle than some other field, which, you're able to kind of choose your specialty because you did so well on step one. And now I'm a little worried on how IMG students and SGU students in particular are going to be able to kind of separate themselves and choose that specialty early on.
Right. So I think that now, and as we were talking before, I think the step 2 CK is going to have a lot more importance. The only problem I see with that is the average step 2 CK score is already so much higher. In fact, it's about a 240. Yeah. So now we're going to have all these kids, doing so much better on step 2 CK. So how are we going to sift through all the 260s and 265 plus when there's so many of them? I also foresee in the future that there's going to be a lot more emphasis on research and maybe volunteering. Especially, putting out papers in your respective field. And I assume I'm going to see a lot of students and a lot of kids taking years off just to get research, because how else are you going to differentiate yourself? And, like you said, it's going to be difficult. So we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, step 2 CK is just going to play such a huge deal, such a huge role in the application process to residency going forward. And I mean, take me through how an SGU student or other IMG even prepares or gets ready for step 2 CK, because it's a little bit different, right? I mean, you have to take it after your rotations, and rotations can be hard to come by or maybe delayed a little bit, right? I understand that. Right. It can be a little bit before you can get to step 2 CK. Exactly.
So at least for SGU students, and most Caribbean med schools go about the same timeline. You're going to want to have your step 2 CK before your residency application is in. Now, a lot of residencies don't require step 2 CK, but just so that it kind of boosts your application, they want it in way before ERAS opens up. So basically, you'll go through your core rotations, your psych, your internal medicine, your surgery, and it's a little bit different than your step 1 because, you have to go to work. You have to go to your rotations as if you have to spend the time there. And really your preparation is kind of like studying for your shelf exams, but there really isn't much of a dedicated study time because, like I said, you have to go to rotations. But by the end of your third year, in between your third and fourth year is when you're going to want to have it done. But now that this is happening, we're probably going to see kids taking all of their elective vacation time just for a dedicated, because the step 2 CK is going to be that much more important.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine how much stress is going to be on that test. I mean, what do you think is going to happen to all the resources and all the stuff that people kind of think about for step 1, right? I mean, the minute you get into medical school, you get a copy of first aid, you start signing up for 2 Q banks, and you go through. And, some of that stuff is still important, but I wonder how that's going to shift the mentality in that first year or two of medical school.
So I've been kind of scouring the online forums, and it seems like some of these companies might be sweating a little bit because, UROL is the gold standard, first aid is the gold standard. We have sketchy, we have pathoma, but in reality, if your goal is just to pass, is it worth spending all the money for these resources? And I can imagine that, I do foresee them maybe raising the passing score, and you're still going to have students who need these resources because there are still going to be students who struggle to pass. But for the vast majority of students, I just can't see them spending as much money and as much resources into these resources as they did before.
Yeah. So on part 1 of this podcast, I actually talked to Dr. David Flick, who's MedSchoolCoach's residency program or director of residency program advising. And we were talking about how U.S. medical students will sort of cope and what will go on there. If you guys haven't listened to part 1 of this podcast, I highly encourage you to do it. You can find it on Apple or Spotify or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. But we were talking a lot about the fact that you can potentially concentrate yourself on being a better doctor now, right? Because so much of step 1 is minutia, memorization, and stuff that you don't necessarily use in clinical practice, whereas step 2 CK may be a little bit more clinically applicable, although that's questionable. It's certainly more clinically applicable than step one, but how that score really translates into you being a good doctor or not, I think that's definitely questionable. But that said, what advice do you think you have for maybe first year IMG students, maybe first year students at SGU who are on the island in terms of how to approach their first year now that you don't have to necessarily worry about memorizing every single fact?
So my actual advice would be to kind of go business as usual, because there still is a correlation to how well you do on STEP and how you do on your board exams and your residency. So, the material isn't necessarily clinically relevant, but it's still the foundation of medicine. And I would go business as usual because, A, you don't want to fail out of medical schools because they're not changing the grading system at these schools. So you still have to learn the material, but I would put less of an emphasis on planning for the future and going for this and studying specifically for the test, and just more focus on the school's tests and make sure that you do well and do well on those school tests, and kind of focus on what you want to do for your residency, because that's the time that you could start maybe getting some research, joining some organizations, and getting your name out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you still have to learn the material, obviously, and particularly for students who are IMG students, and maybe even particularly for those at some of the bigger IMG schools that are, catered towards U.S. students like SGU, like a Ross. Oftentimes going there and just getting in the mindset of study, because that's what I have to do, is still super important. In fact, I think if you get down there and then all of a sudden say, well, step one is just pass, fail, whatever, I'm going to be fine, that sets kind of a slippery slope and a dangerous precedent for you, because there's going to be other factors that as program directors we're going to start looking at, like maybe your performance in those first 2 years. Like as Elias just mentioned, your research that you do, your interest in different specialties. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to have to do in order to separate yourself as a IMG, SGU, Ross, et cetera, student in the future.
And I would not be surprised if residency programs are now asking for class rank. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think it's going to happen, but I really wouldn't be surprised to see, your quartile, your class rank, or your class percentage, or where you rank is going to play a big role too. So I wouldn't necessarily just disregard the information like you were saying earlier. Definitely, you still have to learn, and you have to take that mentality into your clinicals and into your residency, because, as you might have mentioned before, going into residency, you're not done studying. You're never done learning. And you have board examinations and you have recertifications, and it never stops. So if you want to hit the ground running and make sure that you have the right mentality to go into residency and to be the best resident you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of how a international student should approach step two, you talked a little bit about the fact that they're going to have to take it before residency, and maybe they're going to have to take some of their vacation time even during like their dedicated study blocks. How about just learning for that? Like, when do you recommend that somebody kind of start really practicing step two type questions, now that we know it's going to be just so important for future IMG residents or future IMG students who are applying into the match?
Great. So I'll give an example on how I kind of prepared. So I was always told to watch online med-ed. The online med-ed videos are really good. I was told that there are a lot of resources out there like Mastering the Boards, there's First Aid, but really the gold standard is UWorld. The second I started my first rotation, which was OBGYN, I started with the UWorld questions. And it's really just continuous practice, because it's a lot different than step one, as you were saying before. It's not just minute memorization, it's more clinically relevant, arguably more clinically relevant. So as you're doing your rotation, learn as much as you can from your attendings, learn as much as you can, because those guys know, the secrets of the test and what they're more likely to test on. But really the key is continuous evaluation, doing your UWorld questions, watching your videos, staying read up with up to date, and, just challenging yourself on your rotation, and try to impress, your preceptor. Say, hey, I read this new thing, and staying up to date with OBGYN, staying up to date with psych, staying up to date with all the new stuff in medicine. That's really the best way. So when you get to your dedicated study time, your breadth of knowledge is so vast that you're just going to have to kind of just screw in the tiny little details. And after that, it's just easy from there.
How about that student who's currently down on the island, let's say? Obviously, step one is still very important. It's not going to be phased out for the score is not going to be phased out for another 2 years at minimum. The USMLE and NBME announced that January 2022 was the earliest this change would go into effect. And I'm interested that they use the word earliest because that obviously leaves plenty of room for interpretation in terms of when it actually will go into effect. But what about the student that's down there right now that still has to take step one? You know, there might be a mentality of some students down there that say, oh, you know what, this is going pass fail. Maybe I can relax a little bit because residency programs won't really look at this as much, even though I'll have a 3-digit score. I mean, what advice do you give to them?
So I first want to just state that it is a little frustrating that, you know, the USMLE makes it so cryptic and so open to interpretation. We just don't know. It would be nice to have some concrete dates and some concrete information, but, you know, we don't have that. And because we don't have that, my best advice would be business as usual. You know, don't change a thing. Study as hard as you can. Learn the material as best you can, because in reality, you know, slacking off is only going to hurt you.
Yeah, and business as usual definitely is the advice I would give too. You know, as somebody who's looked at a lot of residency applications through ERAS, I can tell you that step one is still going to be super important, at least until it's phased out. We're still going to look at that as kind of the be all and end all, at least for the next couple of years. Now, program directors might start getting in the back of their head that, hey, I'm not going to be able to utilize this in the future. Should I start looking at some other factors in a little bit more detail? But subconsciously, everybody still looks for USMLE Step 1 and to a slightly lesser extent, USMLE Step 2 CK as the baseline to judge students by, particularly to judge international students by. So even though that might end up phasing out slowly, for now, it definitely needs to be, you know, pedal to the metal as you go through the process. As Elias mentioned, you know, use all your resources. I mean, possibly get tutoring because it really is the most important test of your life. I mean, it still is, even though it's going pass fail in 2 years. For you out there right now who are potentially in school or going to be in school in the next year, it's still incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree. It really does suck that, you know, we don't have all the information, but, you know, as you were saying before, you know, they do give their reasons for why they've changed it to the way it is now. And a lot of people are in favor of this pass fail. They think it's a lot better because some people are saying that the test was just a pointless score that doesn't really, you know, matter how well of a doctor you're going to be, but to the matter of fact, like you said earlier, it's still the most important test and you still need to, you know, learn the material. So as you were saying, get tutoring, use your resources, pedal to the metal, and business as usual.
Yeah. Well, listen, this has been an awesome talk. I think that the students out there who are international students certainly, I think, get the point. Right now, business as usual. In the future, really concentrate on step 2 CK because that's going to be super important. Concentrate on getting research opportunities. Concentrate on, you know, becoming involved in clubs. I mean, it may take a year. You may have to take a year off, 2 years off to do research in a specialty, particularly if it's a competitive specialty that you're looking for. I mean, all these things are on the horizon. How they exactly play out, I think, is a little bit unknown. But the bottom line is step 2 CK is going to be super important in the future. All the other things we just talked about are also going to be super important to match into the residency of your choice.
And I wouldn't be surprised. And like I said, it's so impossible to predict, but with all the buzz going on, I could imagine that people are going to be a little wary going to these Caribbean schools or maybe even going to a DO school because, you know, trying to separate yourself from an American medical student is going to be that much harder. So I wouldn't be surprised if people, you know, after undergrad take a year off to get that master's degree or, you know, try again in the next, you know, AAMC or the AMCAS cycle. We just don't know. So, you know, as you were saying earlier, business as usual. That's the mantra.
Yeah, the point of choosing med schools is an excellent one, and one we'll see how it plays out because I used to tell students who, maybe didn't crack into a U.S. med school for whatever reason, listen, you can go down to St. George's, you can go down to Ross, and you can do phenomenally well there, and you're going to have no problem getting a residency. As long as you kick butt on step one, you're going to do great. Like, that was literally my spiel to a lot of students who maybe couldn't crack it or, just didn't do as well as they hoped to in undergrad. But I'm not sure that necessarily is going to translate anymore. And so it's going to be interesting to see how these schools maintain their reputation and maintain their student funnel in light of some of these changes.
And I'm also curious to see from the marketing standpoint what they're going to say, because a lot of the time it was a lot about, they talk about their step one pass rate, or they talk about their match rate or their step one median score, and they put that out there. But the average step one score is not going to matter anymore. So I think maybe the marketing focus might go more to the step two score, or maybe more on the focus of the match. We just don't know.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. It really is. I mean, this little change, seemingly, small change, is going to have just ripple effects, I think, across the board that aren't going to be felt for a while, but are certainly starting. The choosing of schools, the gap years that pre-meds may take in order to avoid going to a school that maybe they think is less reputable or they think is not going to give them as good a chance to match into a residency. I mean, students who are coming from like India and China and those countries that are outside and have studied there and really relied on step one to separate themselves, along with students who are US-based students but went to St. George's or Ross or something along those lines and have relied on step one. I mean, it's going to really be fascinating how all this changes medical education in general. I mean, I'm hoping it changes it for the better, but I think that there's going to be so many ripple effects. It's going to take a while to settle in.
Yeah, I think ripple effect is the perfect way to say it. This reality affects people who are freshmen in college, because you have to start thinking, where am I going to go to medical school? And you said it's going to have profound effects on, the amount of doctors, the quality of doctors, and the number of medical students, and, with student debt and the amount of, the doctor shortage. It's in reality, it's a huge decision that they made. And like I said, I'm with you. I'm fascinated to see how it's going to play out.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Elias. I mean, I think this is great. Your perspective is definitely well received, I think, by a lot of students, particularly because you've gone through the process. You're there. You understand how important this was. I guess we'll see how things play out. I hope you guys found this useful. Again, if you haven't checked out part one of the series, be sure to check out part one of the series where I talked with Dr. David Flick about how this affects U.S. medical students. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast in general, because we have all kinds of great information on USMLE Step 1, USMLE Step 2, becoming a doctor, residency, the whole deal. So be sure to hit subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Elias, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sahil, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you. And, like I said, I wish everyone the best. And like I said, everyone just kind of keep updated and, just see what's going on, see what's going to happen.
Awesome. Good luck, everybody.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and MedSchoolCoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.